Welcome to What to Pair, your no-frills guide for food and wine pairing. Today we are covering pork chops and wine pairing, and here you can see my reviews below for my top 5 favorite picks. I give them all 4 out of 5 stars, and that's just basically because pork chops are generally a neutral meat. There's a lot of flavor granted, but not as much as a juicy steak or something like seafood. There's a lot of variety to how people cook their pork chops. Some people pan fry them, some people bread them, some people crust them with breading and herbs and spices. So that is why most of these pairings get 4 out of 5 stars. And our first pairing up is Pinot Noir and pork chops. So Pinot Noir is a fruity yet earthy red wine. The fruity notes tend to be strawberry and cherry. The earthy notes tend to be like forest floor. Some people say barnyard. I find the acidity cuts through any pan-fried fattiness of pork chops. When we tend to eat fattier foods, you tend to find your taste buds get coated in this fat and protein, and if you bread your pork chops, the breadiness and each bite just starts to taste bland as the meal goes on. When you inject some wine, some acidic wine into the formula, all of those components are whisked away with the acidity, and thus each bite tastes as fresh as the next. I also find pork has an earthy component to it. Pork tends to be a little earthy, and Pinot Noir complements these earthy notes with its own earthy flavors, as well as if you have a nice little pork chop crust going on from pan frying your pork chops, the earthy notes complements that charred kind of earthy flavor that the crust might have. Our next pairing is Zinfandel and pork chops, and of course I give this 4 out of 5 stars. So again, Zinfandel is another acidic red wine, and as we mentioned before, acidity helps cut through the fat. It's also low in tannin, so it won't crush those neutral pork flavors. If you get a heavier red wine like a Cab Sauv, a Shiraz, a Merlot that is quite tannic, you might find that the flavors of pork chops are kind of bashed away by those heavier flavors. With Zinfandel, you have bright fruit flavors that just draw out the subtle pork flavors. I also find with Zinfandel, you get a touch of smokiness, and that's just fantastic with any meat that's been grilled or barbecued. Our third pairing is Torrontés and pork chop pairing, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So Torrontés is a white wine from Argentina. It's got flowery aromatics and peach and lemon zest flavors. Again, high acidity to deal with the fat content. Torrontés has generally 2 styles. One is sweeter and one is drier. I would go with the drier style. Our next pairing is Altbier and pork chop pairing. Now, Altbier is a beer, but I would be remiss if I did not mention it because this beer just loves all things pork, and it is generally a hard beer to find, but I find it has like these elegant fruity notes, plus it has this bitter hop and malt flavor, and that kind of emulates the breading flavor you might get on pork chops. Now, most people, they might bread their pork chops for extra flavor, but it's also to keep the juiciness in. Some people, they really cook their pork well done because there is this notion that if you don't cook your pork well done, you might get sick, and that's carried on through decades. So with alt beer, you don't have to bread your pork because the flavors of this beer, the malty flavors, the hops, they emulate that breading flavor as well. If your pork is a little dry from overcooking, a sip of beer will take care of that in 1 or 2 seconds. Also, with the carbonation and the hops, it cuts through the grease of pork chops, again making each bite taste as fresh as the next. Our final pairing is a full-bodied Chardonnay and pork chops. I give this 4 out of 5 stars. So the round body of a full-bodied Chardonnay, it's not completely acidic. It's got a bit of weight to the body. This complements the juicy pork chop flavors. And again, there is some acidity to Chardonnay. Chardonnay is a white wine, so the acidity cuts through the fattiness of pork chops once again. Maybe not as much as a Torrontés, but it'll do the job. The vanilla and toasty notes, they complement the seared crust or any breading on the pork chops. Plus you get these tropical flavors of pineapple and apple, and they're just a nice contrast. And as we know, pineapple and apple, many people love applesauce with their pork chops as a side, and instead of having applesauce, you can have Chardonnay because it has those nice apple flavors. For more pairing recommendations, visit my website, whattoapair.ca. There I have a nice little database. You just put in whatever you want to pair, whether it be a white wine, a red wine, a food, a beer, and the database will spit out tons of recommendations with rankings. And that wraps up another pairing. Until next week, cheers.